She had been sitting outside the mess hall for 11 hours when Darrow finally noticed her. He almost didn't. The girl was the color of the rock wall she leaned against, same gray-brown, same texture almost, the ridged exoskeleton of her species blending into the basalt like she'd grown there. If she hadn't moved, just a faint tremor in the secondary arms folded flat against her torso, he might have walked right past again with his tray of reconstituted protein and gone back to his bunk like he had the 3 nights before. But she moved, and he stopped. Velthar 9 was not a place that encouraged stopping. The mining outpost ran on motion, drills biting down, conveyor belts chewing ore, boots on graded walkways, the constant percussion of extraction. You moved or you got moved. 11,000 humans worked the rock, and not one of them had stopped for this creature in the 11 hours she'd been sitting there, back against the wall, secondary arms folded in what Darrow had read once was the Kael'Veth gesture for non-aggression. Look, I am making myself small, look. I am not a threat, look, please. Nobody had looked. He looked. She was young. That was the first thing that registered, though he'd only seen 2 Veth in his life up close, and both of them had been dead, photographed in a field assessment he'd been handed during the war. But something about the proportions, the oversized head crest still coming in, the secondary arms not yet fully developed, the eyes too large for the face in the way of juveniles across half the species he'd encountered, told him this was not an adult. She might have been the Veth equivalent of 16. She might have been 12. He genuinely could not tell. What he could tell was that she was starving. The primary indicators were there if you knew what to look for. And Darrow had spent 8 years in a theater where knowing the difference between a fed enemy and a starving one could mean the difference between an ambush and a surrender. The membrane over her eyes had gone from the iridescent blue-green he'd seen in those photographs to a flat, clouded gray. The ridges of her exoskeleton, which in healthy specimens stood proud and sharp, had begun to soften and dimple at the edges, the body consuming itself from inside. And her hands, her primary hands, resting open in her lap, had the slight shake he recognized from long-range reconnaissance footage, the involuntary tremor that started when a Veth's reserves dropped below a critical threshold. He stood there in the corridor with his tray getting cold and made a calculation. It was, he would think later, not really a calculation at all, but he needed to call it that for a while. He crossed the corridor, crouched down to something closer to her eye level. She was seated. He was 6'2" and built from 8 years of things that had tried to kill him and failed, and he didn't want to be a looming shape in her peripheral vision, and said, in the worst Veth he'd ever attempted in his life, "Come eat with me." She stared at him. The clouded membrane over her eyes flickered. A response. Not flight, not aggression, just a flicker like a candle catching a draft. He repeated it. The syntax was probably wrong. The tonal markers were definitely wrong. He was almost certainly saying something closer to "enter food place alongside my inadequate self," but the intent was there, and she was smart, and she caught it. She looked at the tray in his hand, then at the door to the mess hall, then back at him. He stood up, jerked his head toward the door, and waited. After 7 seconds, he counted. She unfolded herself from the wall and stood. Her name, or the closest approximation the human tongue could produce, was Sale. She was 17 standard years. She was the sole surviving member of a colonial survey team of 19 that had made planetfall on Velthar 9's second moon, Velthar Keth, 4 months ago. The moon had not been surveyed for habitation, but the survey team hadn't been looking to habitate. They'd been looking for a mineral deposit whose spectral signature matched a theoretical compound their science cast had been chasing for 60 years. They'd found it. They'd also found an unstable methane pocket directly beneath it, which the survey team's geologist had failed to identify because the survey team's geologist had been, in Sale's flat and factual recounting, young and overconfident. a phrase Darrow recognized as a diplomatic rendering of something much worse. 19 had gone down, one had come back up. She had walked from the secondary moon's shuttle port to Velthar 9 main facility, a distance of approximately 40 kilometers across terrain that had no business being walked, not by anything bipedal, not in the temperature swings that characterized the Velthar system's rotation cycle, carrying only what she'd grabbed from the wreckage before the secondary explosion started. Her pack contained a dead communicator, 6 ration bars, a personal effects pouch belonging to a crewmate named Tail Vethorisan who had died before Sail could reach her, and a small flat-plate data recorder containing the survey team's final transmissions. That last item she had not put down once. She held it the way humans hold things they cannot afford to lose, not tight, not precious, but constant, always in hand or within reach. The transmissions were the last record of 19 people who had gone out and not come back, and she was 17 and she was the only one, and she was carrying them. Darrow understood that weight. He recognized it the way you recognize the face of someone you've seen in a mirror. He set his tray down in front of her when they found a table in the corner of the mess hall corner. He'd noted automatically, because corners meant one direction of approach, and went back to the line to get a second tray, and after a moment's consideration, a third, because he didn't know what a Veth's metabolic requirements were for recovery from near starvation, and the sensible approach was to over-prepare. The mess hall had gone quiet in the particular way of places that are still making noise, but where the noise has become performance. 200 and some miners eating their evening rotation meal, and every one of them was very carefully not looking at the gray-brown creature sitting at table 17, with her secondary arms folded, and her eyes going slowly from flat-clouded to something slightly less flat, looking away with the specific energy of people who have opinions they're choosing not to voice yet. Darrow had operated in rooms like this. He knew exactly how long the quiet would last. He sat back down, pushed one tray across to her, and ate. The first bite she took was small, exploratory. The protein paste was not good by any objective measure. The Velthar 9 kitchen operated on the principle that nutrition was the goal and flavor was a bonus they hadn't gotten around to, but she ate it, and her eyes changed again, the membrane going from flat gray to something that had the beginning of color in it. "More," he said in Veth this time. She looked at him, then at the extra tray, then back at him. "Yes," she said in careful, accented standard, "please." That last word, please, landed somewhere in the architecture of his chest and rearranged something. He pushed the second tray across. His name was Darrow Vase, 31 standard years. Former combat engineer, 2nd Expansion Theater, 6 citations, 1 reprimand for a dispute with an officer whose name he'd spent 3 years trying to forget, and a burn scar that ran from his left jawline down his neck, and across the left side of his chest in the specific pattern left by a plasma-edged rupture at close range. The scar was why he'd ended up on Velthar 9. Not directly, but in the way that one thing leads to another and another until you look up and you're 40 light years from where you started, and the thing you are doing with your life is mining ore on a rock that doesn't have a proper name, just a designation and a number. He'd been in the war. He didn't advertise this on Velthar 9. In the 2nd Expansion Theater, the humans had been on the offensive, and the Veth had been on the other side. And Velthar 9 was the kind of place people came to specifically not think about which side they'd been on. The work didn't care. The rock didn't care. You drilled and you extracted and you slept and you ate, and the weeks went by and the months went by, and eventually the contract ended and you went somewhere else. He'd been here 14 months. He had 4 months left on his contract. He had not, in 14 months, spoken more than 3 words consecutively to anyone on this outpost. This was not antisocial behavior, or not entirely. It was more that he had developed, over 8 years of a war and 3 years of trying to find something to do after it, a precise calibration of how much of himself to spend on any given day, and he had learned that the spending went better when it was deliberate. He had spent something deliberate on the Veth girl in the corridor. He was not yet sure what he'd get back for it, if anything, or if that was even the right frame. She ate 3 full trays. Not fast, she ate like someone who had been taught to eat correctly, and was maintaining the form even when starving, which told him something about her upbringing. The data recorder sat on the table next to her left primary hand the entire time. When the second tray was empty and she was halfway through the third, she looked up and caught him watching the recorder. 19 people, she said in standard. Her accent shaped the vowels differently, made them rounder, but the words were clean. I heard, he said. You did not flinch. He considered this. Why would I? She made a movement with her crest down and then up, slow, that he identified from his briefing materials as something in the range of I don't know, but I expected it. They all flinched, she said. The ones who looked at me before. The ones who, she paused, reorganizing, walked past. They all flinched first. The burn scar felt tight the way it sometimes did in low humidity. He didn't touch it. I look worse than you do, he said. Probably. A sound came from her. He took a moment to identify it. It was, he realized, a laugh. Veth laughter was lower and more percussive than human laughter, a sort of rhythmic clicking deep in the chest cavity, and it was the most unexpected thing he'd heard on Velthar 9 in 14 months. You are an unusual human, she said. I've been told, he said. The mess hall had been slowly repopulating its noise. The performance of not looking had given way to actual not looking, which was different, less charged, more habitual. 200 miners going back to their food and their own conversations because the thing at table 17 had not turned out to be a crisis, and crises were the only thing worth sustained attention on Velthar 9. But not everyone. 3 tables over, a man named Grun Darrow didn't know his last name, but he knew his face and the voice that went with it, which was loud and had opinions, was watching with the specific quality of attention that precedes commentary. Darrow ate his protein paste and waited. It took 4 days for the situation to become what he'd known it would become, which he considered reasonable. He'd been running a softer expectation of 2 days, so 4 was almost optimistic. The problem was not precisely that the facility had a policy about Veth. It didn't. Velthar 9 was technically neutral territory under the Compact Accords, which meant it operated outside the jurisdiction of the human military authority and the Veth Sovereign Council both. And what that meant practically was that its rules were whatever the facility director said they were, plus whatever the collective weight of human opinion in a confined space could enforce without the facility director needing to formally notice it. The facility director's name was Marit. She had a face like a closed door and a management philosophy that could be summarized as extraction quotas met, paperwork filed, problems resolved before they became incidents in the official record. She was not a bad person. She was a person who had decided that the definition of her problem was very specific and did not include things that happened in corridors. The collective weight of human opinion on Velthar 9 had, in 4 days, arrived at a position. The position was communicated to Darrow on the morning of the 5th day by Grun, who had the build of someone who had spent his whole life doing physical work and the eyes of someone who had developed a philosophy around it. He caught Darrow in the equipment bay before the morning shift, with 3 other miners whose names Darrow had similarly not bothered to learn, and he explained the position. The position was: the Veth were the enemy. The war was barely 2 years past armistice. 17 people had died on this rock from Veth aggression in the last engagement before the armistice. Darrow himself had the scar to prove what the Veth were capable of, and it was one thing to let a stray alien sit in a corridor, but it was another thing entirely to bring it inside and feed it at the table, and let it stay like it was people. And the men on this rock had lost brothers and hadn't forgotten. and Darrow might want to think about what team he was on. Darrow listened to all of this. Grun was not, to his credit, speaking quietly. The equipment bay had maybe 40 people in it preparing for the morning shift, and every one of them was aware of the conversation. When Grun finished, Darrow said, "She's 17. Her whole team is dead. She walked 40 kilometers to get here." Grun said that wasn't the point. Darrow said, "What's the point?" Grun said the point was what they were, what they'd done, and that people didn't forget. Darrow looked at him for a moment. Then he said, in the tone of someone delivering information and not an argument, "I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking you to pass the protein paste." He left for his shift. He was not under any illusions that this had resolved anything. But he had said what he meant, which was more than he'd managed in 14 months, and the equipment bay had heard it, and that was the shape of what was available to him right now. Sale had been assigned temporary accommodation in the facility's overflow section. 6 bunks in a room designed for 3, currently occupied by 2 off-rotation workers who had taken one look at the assignment sheet and requested reassignment. So she had the room to herself, which was either accommodation or isolation depending on how you looked at it. Darrow brought her food twice a day. He told himself the first few times that this was logistical. She didn't know the mess hall schedule. She didn't have a facility account. The bureaucratic pathway for getting her formally processed as a temporary resident was moving at the pace of a facility director who had classified this as not her problem. But by the 4th day, he stopped telling himself that and accepted that he was doing it because he was choosing to do it, which was cleaner. They talked, carefully at first, the way 2 people talk when they are not sure what the other one is exactly, and are trying to figure it out without making a mistake they can't take back. Her standard was good, formally learned rather than immersively acquired, which meant it had the grammar right and the idiom wrong in ways that were occasionally startling and frequently interesting. She didn't know "don't beat around the bush," but she knew osteoporosis. She knew the correct pronunciation of 17 human political figures' names, but had never heard the word hangover. He told her about the ore. She asked questions that told him she had been taught to always ask the next question after the answer. He told her about the drill specs. She asked about the geological composition. He told her about the seam profiles. She asked about the thermal gradients. He realized at some point during the 4th conversation that she was doing what he did, not having small talk but having large talk broken into small pieces, which was a different thing. She told him about the colony she'd come from. Vethkor, the 3rd deep space colony her people had established, young by their standards, 60 years old, which was still a generation learning how to be a place. She'd been born there. Her parents were both researchers. Her father in spectral geology, her mother in xenobotany, which was how she'd ended up on a survey team at 17. Not as crew, officially, but as an observer apprentice, a formal training designation that let young Veth work alongside experienced teams to learn how the work was actually done rather than how it was written in manuals. She had been, she said, standing at the edge of the site when the pocket ruptured. She said it in the flat, careful way of someone who has been over the fact many times and has learned to carry it without flinching, which did not mean it didn't hurt. He recognized that too. "The recorder," he said one evening, when they had been talking for 2 hours and the food was gone, and she was still holding it in her left primary hand the way she always was. She looked down at it. "Yes." "Did anyone," he paused, "have you been able to transmit it?" A long pause. The membrane over her eyes, which had been steadily returning to its iridescent blue-green as the starvation receded, cycled through one full rotation, a contemplative gesture he'd come to learn. "The facility communication array does not have the encryption format for Veth sovereign channels," she said, "and the human communication relays." She stopped. "The human communication relays would route it through military monitoring," he said. "Yes." He sat with that for a moment. A survey team of 19 Veth, dead on a moon in contested but technically neutral space. A 17-year-old girl carrying the last record of who they'd been and what they'd found, and the only available communications going through a system that would flag a Veth transmission for review by people who had opinions about Veth. "I have a personal transmitter," he said, "military surplus. It uses a civilian encryption wrapper I bought after I left service." He paused. "I don't know if the Veth Sovereign Council uses the same civilian format, but it might get past the monitoring flag." She was very still. "Why," she said, "would you do that?" He thought about it, not performing the thought, actually thinking about it, because she deserved an honest answer. "Because 19 people died," he said, "and someone should know their names." The transmitter worked. Partially. The civilian encryption wrapper didn't align cleanly with the Veth Sovereign Council's civilian band frequency, but it aligned well enough that the transmission went out flagged as a low-priority commercial signal rather than a Veth military communication, which meant it would get there eventually rather than getting intercepted and reviewed. She had sat with him while he configured it. The data recorder connected to the transmitter through an adapter he'd improvised out of 2 incompatible port formats and approximately 4 hours of swearing. When the transmission confirmed as sent, she had held the recorder for a long time, and then she had set it down on the bunk between them and looked at it without picking it up again. He understood. She'd carried the weight until someone else could share it. She could put it down now. He didn't say any of this. He just sat there and she sat there, and after a while she said, "My mother will receive this." "Good," he said. "She will know I am alive." "Yes." Another pause, then, "She will also know I ate protein paste." He looked at her. She made the crest movement that he'd learned was sheepish down, tilted sideways, very slightly back up, and he understood that this was a joke, specifically that Veth xenobotanists had opinions about their children's nutritional choices, and he laughed, which surprised him. He hadn't laughed since the war. He hadn't noticed until now. Grun escalated on day 9. Darrow had expected it. The pattern was familiar: the initial confrontation, the insufficient response from his target, the gathering of allies, the escalation. He'd seen it in training facilities and forward operating bases, and once, distressingly, in a civilian relief camp where the people who were supposed to be on the same side had found someone smaller to subdivide against. The escalation took the form of a formal complaint to Facility Director Merritt, signed by 23 minors, citing the Compact Accord's non-citizen provision as grounds for removing Sale from the facility pending formal review of her status as a temporary resident. The non-citizen provision was real. It was also, Darrow had looked up that evening with the facility's legal database, applicable only to Compact member species, and the Veth had not ratified the Compact. The Compact had been, in fact, one of the things the 2-year war had been partially about. He brought this to Merritt's office the next morning. Merritt looked at him across her desk with the face of the closed door and said that the complaint had been filed, and she was obligated to process it. He said he understood. He said the provision didn't apply. He laid out the legal database's output in a folder on her desk. She looked at the folder, she looked at him. "Vase," she said, "you know what this facility is. You know what these men have been through." "I know," he said. "I also know what she's been through." "She's not our concern." "She is now," he said, "because she's here, and she's 17, and her team is dead, and she needs to stay somewhere while the Veth Council processes her rescue request, which I'm told takes between 3 and 6 weeks. He paused. 6 weeks of protein paste costs the facility approximately 40 credits, removing her costs more than that in the security incident it will generate. You're a practical person. I'm giving you the practical case. Merritt was quiet for a long time. "I can give her 30 days, she said finally, Registered as temporary labor. She does work. She stays out of the common areas except the mess hall during off-peak hours. Off-peak hours meant the mess hall was nearly empty. It meant she ate alone or close to it. It was not what he would have chosen. Agreed, he said, because it was what was available, and what was available was what you worked with. She was good at the work. This surprised some people, and should not have surprised anyone. The Veth were, as a species, considerably better at fine spatial reasoning than humans, a biological legacy of their evolutionary history, which had selected for the ability to map three-dimensional structures in low-light conditions. And fine spatial reasoning was precisely what the OR assessment work required. She could read a seam profile in half the time it took the experienced human assessors, and she made fewer errors, which was verifiable in the output data. Darrow had put her on his team without asking Merritt, on the grounds that Merritt had said temporary labor and had not specified what kind. Her foreman, a quiet man named Tesler who had the air of someone who had decided long ago that his job was to assess quality and not to have opinions about the people producing it, had looked at her first output and said, and then looked at it again and said, assign her the east seam profiles. She worked. The east seam profiles got done faster than they'd been done in 14 months. Grun watched this with the expression of someone whose argument was being inconveniently undermined by facts. The men on Tesler's team watched it differently, not with hostility or warmth at first, but with the assessment of people who value competence and were seeing it in an unexpected place. One of them, a woman named Priya who had lost a brother in the second expansion theater, and whose opinion Grun had been counting on, watched Sale work the East Seam analysis for 2 hours one afternoon, and then said to nobody in particular, "She's fast." Nobody responded, but nobody disagreed. Day 19. The cafeteria, off-peak hours, Darrow eating dinner across from Sale while she ate what he'd calculated was probably her 6th and final stage of recovery nutrition. The membrane was fully iridescent now. The ridge edges of her exoskeleton had sharpened back up. The tremor in her primary hands was gone. She was eating carefully, with the correct form, and looking at the data recorder, which was on the table between them the way it always was but which she was no longer holding. She had not held it since the transmission. When the council responds, she said, they will send a shuttle. Yes. 6 weeks maximum, possibly 3. Possibly. She moved the recorder slightly with one finger, not picking it up, just touching it. I will go back to Veth Core, she said. I figured. My mother will want to, she paused, choosing, make me eat better than protein paste. He smiled, probably justified. She will also want me to finish my apprenticeship. Also probably justified. A pause, she was looking at the recorder, then she looked at him. You were in the war, she said. It wasn't a question. He'd known she'd identified it, the scar, the equipment bay incident, the way he moved through contested spaces that civilians didn't. She'd known since day one and had been waiting, and he'd been waiting too, and this was apparently the night. Yes, he said. Which theater? Second expansion. The membrane cycled once, slow, contemplative. My mother's sister died in the second expansion, she said. He held that, not flinching. He'd promised himself not to make her watch him flinch, not about this, but holding it with the weight it deserved. I'm sorry, he said. She was military, Sale said. She knew the risk. My mother has said this many times. A pause. I think my mother says it because it is true, and also because it helps to say it. Yes, he said, it does. Did you lose people? Yes. Did you say things to make it easier? He thought about it. I said things that were true, he said. I don't know if that's the same as making it easier. She looked at him with the full iridescent blue-green of recovered, healthy Veth eyes, and he had the sudden precise feeling of being seen by something that was not measuring him for threat or value, but was simply looking, the way you look at a thing when you want to know what it actually is. "You said come eat with me," she said, "in very bad Veth." "Very bad," he agreed. "It was the right thing," she said, "the bad Veth. If you had spoken it correctly, I think I might have been more frightened. It sounded like," she paused, the crest tilting with the effort of translation, "like you were trying very hard with something very simple, which was honest." He looked at her. He thought about the burn scar and the 14 months and the 3 years before that and the 8 years before that, and the long specific cost of all of it, and about a girl who had walked 40 kilometers carrying 19 dead people and had sat against a wall for 11 hours with her secondary arms folded saying, "Look, I'm making myself small, look. I am not a threat, look, please." "I was," he said. Day 26, the mess hall full rotation peak hours. It had not been planned. He would be honest about this later to himself and once to Tesler, who had asked. It had not been planned. He had simply been the first one out of the equipment bay, and had therefore been the first one in the meal line, and Sale had come in from the East Seam assessment shift at the same time, and they had gone through the line together the way you go through the line with the person walking next to you. And when he had turned to look for the off-peak table in the corner, he had found that Priya was already sitting down at table 12, and had left her tray across from her in the specific way that means that seat is taken. He had looked at Priya, Priya had looked at Sale, Priya had not said anything. She had moved her secondary tray, the extra bread roll she'd taken with ambiguous intentions, and pushed it toward the empty seat across from her and gone back to eating. Sale had sat down. Darrow had sat down next to Sale. Tesler had sat down next to Priya. After a moment, a man named Orville, who had been in the equipment bay on the morning of Grun's confrontation, and who had said nothing then and was saying nothing now, but who sat down on the other side of Darrow. The mess hall kept eating. Grun was at a table at the far end. He looked at table 12 for a long time, then he looked at his food, then he ate his food. It was not a victory, it was not a declaration, it was people eating dinner. But it was specific people eating dinner, and the specificity of it was, Darrow thought, the only kind of answer that was ever actually true. The council shuttle arrived on day 31. It was a small craft, diplomatic registry, hull markings that identified it as from the Civilian Rescue and Recovery Division rather than military. 2 Veth crew and a mediator whose job was to process Sale's status and transport her back to Veth Corps. She packed in 20 minutes. She had almost nothing. The overflow room had given her very little, which meant there was very little to take from it. The data recorder went into her pack first, carefully, but not the same way she had carried it on the moon. Carried like something she was bringing with her, not like something she couldn't put down. Darrow walked her to the shuttle bay. They had said the large things in small pieces over 31 days, and there was not much left to formally say. She walked beside him on the graded walkway, secondary arms folded in their habitual non-aggression position, and then at some point between the equipment level and the bay she unfolded them, and they walked the last 100 meters with her secondary arms unfolded, which was not, he was fairly sure, the non-aggression gesture anymore. It was something else. Something that simply had no human analog, and so just was. At the bay entrance, she stopped and turned to face him. "Your Veth is still very bad," she said. "I know. You should learn it properly." "I thought about it," he said. "There's a program. For the post-war reconstruction work, they need people who can do both, assess geological formations and communicate in Veth. I'm told the salary is better than mining." She was very still. The mediator and the 2 crew were waiting by the shuttle. The bay had the particular quality of sound that enclosed spaces have when they are almost quiet, the hum of the ventilation, the distant percussion of the drills, 11,000 people doing their work. That would be, she started. Yes, he said. The crest came down and up slow, the laugh low and percussive brief. Come eat with me, she said, in standard, with her accent making the vowels round. Yes, he said, exactly like that. She turned and walked to the shuttle. She did not look back, which he understood was not coldness but form. The Veth gesture of departure was forward-facing, a statement that the parting was clean, and the path was clear, and the weight of it was carried inward rather than displayed. He had looked this up on day 3, and it had helped him, and he thought of it now. He watched the shuttle lift. It was small against the darkness of the Velthar system, and then it was smaller, and then it was a point of reflected light indistinguishable from the stars, and then it was gone. He stood in the bay for a while. The ventilation hummed. The drills continued their work. He thought about the reconstruction program. He thought about the application, which he had already downloaded and read through twice, which required a letter of intention and 2 references, and a demonstration of basic Veth language comprehension. He thought about how his Veth was genuinely very bad, and would require significant investment to become merely bad before it could become something workable. He thought about a girl sitting against a wall for 11 hours with her secondary arms folded, and her eyes the flat gray of something running out of time, and about the specific human thing of stopping, of making a calculation that was not really a calculation, and crossing the corridor. He thought about the particular shape of what had been available, and what you did with it. Then he went back to his bunk, opened the application, and began to write. 4 months later, the last shift. He handed in his equipment badge to the checkout station and collected his final pay. Outside the facility, the surface vehicles were lined up for the transit to the shuttle port, miners rotating out and miners rotating in, the constant replacement that kept Velthar 9 running. Tesla was at the checkout ahead of him. His contract had ended 2 weeks prior, but he'd stayed for reasons he had described as logistical, and which Darrow understood meant something more personal and less precise. Reconstruction work, Tesla said, without looking up from his own paperwork. Yes, Darrow said. Where? Vethkor to start. Tesla wrote something on his form. The Geological Survey Program. Adjacent to it, language and liaison work. A pause. Tesla signed his form, took his badge receipt, and stepped aside for the next person. The letter of intention they send you, he said, asks why you want to do this. I know I wrote it. What did you say? Darrow thought about it. He had written several drafts of the answer to this question. The drafts had been various degrees of honest and various degrees of articulable. The final version had been 2 sentences, which he thought was right, not brief because he didn't care, but brief because what was true didn't need much scaffolding. I said, he said, that I spent a long time knowing what the other side looked like from far away. I wanted to know what it looked like from close up. Tesla looked at him for a moment. He said, which was what Tesla said when he had no objection. Darrow picked up his badge receipt and walked out into the Velthar 9 surface, where the transit vehicles were waiting, and the stars were doing what they always did in the absence of atmosphere, which was be clear and vast and numerous in a way that was either overwhelming or clarifying, depending on what you brought to it. He thought it was clarifying. He got in the vehicle and went. Vethkor smelled like nothing he'd expected. He had prepared himself with some rigor for alienness, alien air, alien flora if any, alien architecture certainly. What he hadn't prepared for was the smell of bread. The colony's main settlement had a bakery. It had been established, he was told by the liaison who met him at the landing pad, a human woman named Cass who had been doing this work for 6 years, and had the easy fluency in Veth of someone who had stopped thinking about it. By a Veth researcher who had developed an interest in human baking in the early days of the colony, and had spent 30 years perfecting a recipe for something that was not quite bread, but was close enough to share the smell. "Bread smell," Cass said, "turns out to be useful for first impressions." "I imagine," he said. His language comprehension test was scheduled for the next morning. His accommodation was in the liaison workers' compound, which was small and bare and comfortable, the specific comfort of a place designed by people who understood what it was to be in an unfamiliar place. He had been there 40 minutes when his communicator pinged. The message was from a Veth account he did not recognize. He opened it. It said in standard, "My mother's bread is better than protein paste. Come eat with me." He sat on the bunk in the small, bare, comfortable room and laughed for a long time. It felt, he thought, like something opening, not a wound, not a scar, but a door he'd sealed a long time ago for reasons that had made sense then and which he was now, slowly and with some effort, remembering how to walk through. He wrote back, "On my way." He meant it in the immediate sense. Her message included an address, 40 minutes from the compound on foot. He also meant it in the other sense, the larger one that the smaller one was a container for. He had been on his way for a while. He was beginning to recognize the path.